Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we're going to continue our reading of Village Centenary by Miss Reed. We are in the middle of August. Mr. Willett turned up the next morning, balancing a pair of shears on the bars of his bicycle. "Promised I'd do that box edging," he shouted through the kitchen window. "All right to tackle it now? Got a wedding this afternoon." "Hello, Bob," said Miss Clare, appearing in the doorway. "Well, I'm blowed," said Mr. Willett, beaming. "And how be you keepin', Dolly? You looks younger 'n ever. Got some magic secret, have you?" Dolly Clare laughed. "I don't say much about my aches and pains, Bob. Doesn't do any good and bores people stiff." "I tells everyone if I got a finger ache," replied Mr. Willett robustly. "Makes me feel a dern sight better when I've unloaded all my woes onto someone else." She followed her old friend into the sunshine, and I watched them talking animatedly as Bob Willett surveyed the job to be tackled. They would have plenty of gossip to exchange, I guessed. Reg Thorne's business was closed for a fortnight's holiday, so we were spared the racket of banging tools, the boys' transistor, and their vigorous exchange of opinions over football and cricket matters. When I carried out the coffee cups some time later, the sun was so hot that we dragged my ancient deck chairs into the shade of the apple tree. "Funny how you can drink hot coffee winter and summer," commented Mr. Willett, drying his mustache on the back of his hand, "and still it do you a power of good." "They're a fine pair of shears," observed Dolly, eyeing the shining blades resting on the grass by Bob's feet. "Yes, well, I likes my own tools. Miss Reed here do have a pair of shears, so-called, but they does more harm than good, twizzling up the sappy bits and wrenching away at the twiggy bits like a host of rats had been at work." "Thanks," I said. "No need to be snarky," said Mr. Willett amiably. "Some knows how to look after tools and some don't, that's all I'm saying." He struggled from the deck chair. "I suppose I'd best get on. You women would keep me here all morning with your gossiping." "Well," I began. "By the way, I see that young Simon in the village as I come up here. He's staying with the Mauns, d'you know?" I hadn't heard. "How does he look?" "Much the same as ever, a long streak of nothing and looking as though butter wouldn't melt in his mouth, the young varmint. When I think of our Snowy as he did in, I could give that boy a leatherin' and enjoy it." Mr. Willett's face grew puce at the remembrance of Simon's part in the death of the Fairacres albino robin, not so long ago. I decided to change the subject. "Any chance of seeing you here tomorrow?" "I might manage that if I'm spared. This edging of yours will need a few hours on it, the state it's got into." I picked up the tray and left Dolly to watch her old friend at work. In the kitchen, putting the cups to soak, I wondered if Simon's parents had come to Fairacre to have a look at Joan Benson's house. I did not propose to mention this possibility to anyone, as I did not want to spread any rumors. However, no matter how prudently I held my tongue, there was no doubt in my mind whatever that whatever was decided under the Mauns and the Bensons' roofs would very soon be common knowledge in our little community. Miss Clare was with me for a week, and the weather stayed sunny for all that time. We took picnic lunches up on the downs or down by the little brook at Springbourne as it purled along beneath trooping willows on its way to join the Cax before the river flowed through Caxley. Everywhere we went held memories for Dolly, and like all old people, her early years were clearer in her mind than more recent ones. I found her recollections fascinating and only wished I had a recording machine with me all the time. It certainly made me decide to get one ready for the Centenary Day when I could record her talk for future generations. Dolly's lifetime spanned the age-old rural life of hard work geared to the pace of man and horse, and the modern life geared to the pace of cars, lorries, and aircraft. Children of Dolly's generation were lucky to have traveled 20 miles from home. Many of them had never seen the sea, some 60 or 70 miles distant, nor traveled in a train, nor visited a town any larger than Caxley. Their grandchildren thought nothing of flying anywhere across the globe, of talking to relatives in New Zealand as they sat by their own firesides, and of buying the produce of the world set out temptingly at the village shop. Once Dolly and her contemporaries had gone, the way of life which had been known and expressed in poetry, prose, and pictures for centuries would vanish. It was a sobering thought. But it was the small personal memories that I cherished as we took our drives around the countryside, which Dolly knew so well. "That was where old Mrs. Johns lived," she said, as we passed a tumble-down cottage with a collapsed roof of thatch. "She wore a bustle, you know, till the end of her life, a funny little soul who kept that place spotless." "Ernie White was killed in that field," she commented. "A tractor tipped over and pinned the poor soul there for hours. People said it was a judgment for doing away with the horses." She sighed. "And that's where Emily's Edgar lived. She should have been there by rights, but he married his nurse, you know, and my dear Emily never got over it, brave face though she showed to the world." She showed me where she and Emily tobogganed as children, where she took her pupils to collect hazelnuts and frog spawn, and then holly to decorate St. Patrick's Church at Christmas time. It was borne in upon me how closely the seasons were woven into the fabric of the country child's life in those days. They were out so much more than today's children. They walked everywhere. No school buses whisked them past beds of violets, wild strawberries, sprays of luscious blackberries, all known and treasured by their grandparents. One afternoon I invited Mrs. Austen to tea, and it was a rare treat for me to listen to the wartime reminiscences of evacuee and teacher at Fairacre School in the early 40s. "Everything was so different from our home and school at New Cross in South London," said Mrs. Austen. "For one thing, I was used to an enormous three-story building with infants on the ground floor, big girls on the next, and boys at the top. It was lovely to be mixed up together, such a few of us, it seemed, in a dear little school like Fairacres." "You certainly settled down wonderfully," commented Miss Clare. "I think I found the biggest differences, though, at Mrs. Pratt's, where we were billeted. She couldn't have been kinder, and I kept in touch with her until she died. But there were some things which shook me as a child. No flush lavatory, for one, and lighting lamps and candles instead of switching on the electric light. I dreaded having to go down the garden to the privy in the dark. Mrs. Pratt used a hurricane lamp for me, but it cast such shadows I was even more terrified." "Was there no commode in your bedroom?" inquired Miss Clare with concern. "Well, yes, but I hated using it. It seemed so wrong to me. I'd never met such a thing, you see. And another thing that appalled me was the number of flies everywhere, and all taken for granted. At home in London, my mother bustled a stray fly away as if it were poisonous, which it was, I always thought, but Mrs. Pratt even had a paper ball hung up near the ceiling and called it the flies' playground." "We had one too, I remember," said Miss Clare. "There was another ball on the mantelpiece made of silver paper. We all collected every scrap of tinfoil, and it was carefully wrapped round the ball. It was an enormous weight. I can't think what happened to it eventually." "It went to the hospital in Caxley," Miss Clare told her. "Still does, I believe, but now they like it flat." "I was very fond of Mrs. Pratt," said Mrs. Austen, "but frightened of her old mother, who lived down the road. Do you remember that little boy, I forget his name, who lived with her?" "I do indeed," said Dolly. "He was called Stephen, a foster child, and really old Mrs. Hall had no business to have him. She was far too frail and suffered from tuberculosis, and in any case much too ancient to take care of a young child. But it was difficult to find homes for those orphans, and I suppose the local authority thought it was suitable. In any case, the Halls needed the maintenance money, but I was glad when that child was moved elsewhere." "So was I. I used to collect him to bring him along to school, and the smell in that house was ghastly. And the poor old thing was always coughing. She used to crouch on the rag rug in front of the fire with the ashpan pulled out and spit horribly into the hot ashes. Sometimes she had no breath to speak to me, but just gazed at me with those watery blue eyes and motioned me to take Stephen out of the way. I did, too, as quickly as I could." "He went into the army eventually," Dolly told her, "and did very well. I still hear from him at Christmas, dear boy." Her voice was warm with affection. Were there any of her pupils, I wondered, who failed to kindle a spark of remembered happiness in their old teacher? Even the malefactors, dealt with sternly in their youth, were now seen through the rosy haze of time. And why not? I took Dolly back to her cottage with the greatest reluctance. I had enjoyed her serene company so much, but she insisted that she had a number of little household jobs to do and some bottles of fruit to prepare for the store cupboard, so that I left her looking happy in her shining kitchen with the cat for company. I went on to Bent to lunch with Amy. I found her house as welcoming and beautiful as Dolly Clare's, although 3 times the size, of course. "How do you manage to keep it so immaculate?" I cried. "I've never seen a speck of dust or one dead flower in this place all the years I've visited here." "Elementary organization," said Amy. "You too could have an immaculate house if you planned your routine." "You remind me of those advertisements, Amy. You too can have a beautiful bust." I liked the one about piano playing in our youth. "You too can be a concert pianist," or something like that. "Better than that. My friends used to laugh when I sat down at the piano. Remember that one?" "Mine still do," said Amy. "It must be lovely to have a talent of some sort." "How's the autobiography?" Oh dear, I was afraid you'd ask. I'm stuck at myself aged 8, and all I can remember are idiotic things like tying reef knots as a brownie, and my father cranking up our first family car, and having to help him fix canvas and mica side curtains to it when it rained. I don't think it's very stirring stuff, not a bit like some of these successful memoirs where the authors remember all sorts of psychological hookups and traumatic experiences when they found the cat having kittens in the laundry basket. I wonder why they can do it and I can't. "Probably because you have a much more normal mind," I assured her. "And anyway, who's to know they didn't make it all up?" "I never thought of that." "Frankly, I should shelve it for a week or two and go back to it when you feel like it. Anyway, the weather's too good to stick about indoors pushing the pen." "I believe you're right. I've hardly been into Caxley at all since starting the book. Incidentally, I saw your young teacher there the last time I was shopping." "Our Miss Briggs? I wonder what she was doing in Caxley. I thought she was at home in one of those spas, Droitwich or Buxton or somewhere up north." "Malvern, perhaps." "Malvern's west, dear. She was with a young man, and they appeared to be very affectionate." "Well, I'm blowed. Perhaps she came back to collect something and brought her young man with her from Harrogate or wherever. It was during the holidays, I take it, that you saw her?" "Yes, the beginning of last week." "Well, I'm glad to hear she's found an interest at last. It may liven her up. Mr. Willett calls her a fair old lump of a girl, and I don't think one can better that description." "Poor thing," said Amy. "Anyway, she looked quite animated and pretty in the High Street." "Ah, the transformation wrought by love. I must try it sometime." "I wish you would," said Amy forcefully, returning to a well-worn theme. "But aren't you leaving it rather late?" "Trust old friends to tell you the unpalatable truth." Mrs. Pringle arrived to bottom me, as she elegantly terms performing the house cleaning. Sometimes she only has time to put me to rights, and that is bad enough. To be bottomed involves taking down curtains and pictures, pulling out a heavy Welsh dresser, and generally creating mayhem. I try and make myself scarce when threatened with bottoming, but on this occasion there was no escape, as I was expecting the lawnmower to be returned from the repairers and wanted to pay him. Halfway through the dire proceedings, I was allowed to pick my way through displaced furniture piled in the kitchen to put on the kettle for a restorative cup of tea. Mrs. Pringle, militant in a flowered overall with the sleeves rolled up to expose wrestlers' forearms, had a fanatical look in her eye. "You seen that top of the dresser of yours?" she asked. "No, what's wrong with it?" "Wrong with it?" echoed Mrs. Pringle triumphantly. "It's got 2 inches of dust on it as you could grow potatoes in." "Oh, come," I began weakly. "And what's more, down the back was a letter unopened and dated months ago." "Good heavens, where is it?" Mrs. Pringle handed me an envelope. The address was handwritten, and I recognized it as Lucy Clayton's writing. She had been at college with Amy and me, and I cordially detested her. "No one that matters," I said with some relief, and made the tea. We took it into the garden. The sight of my house I found upsetting. "Well, I must say it's a treat to breathe a bit of clean air after all that dust and filth," announced Mrs. Pringle, stirring her tea. "You heard about Mrs. Partridge?" "No, what happened?" "She had to go to the hospital, poor soul." I was genuinely shocked. I am devoted to our vicar's wife, and the thought of her in hospital was even more upsetting than the chaos in my house. When did she go? Last Saturday. And it's Wednesday today. I am sorry. What is it, do you know? Bees. The vicar's bees. But she wouldn't need to be 4 days in the hospital with a bee sting, surely. Who said she was? What? In hospital for 4 days. All I said was she went in Saturday. She come out Saturday, too. Mrs. Pringle took a long draught of tea and looked complacent. She has brought irritating her listeners to a fine art, I'll give her that. Well, go on, tell me all from the beginning. Mrs. Partridge told me herself that she was simply up the garden picking some nice sprigs of parsley to make parsley sauce for a nice bit of fresh haddock she's got from that nice fishmonger in Caxley, who probably has a nice shop, I thought impatiently. Miles away from the hive, she says, when one of the nasty things came and bit her in the eye, and she swelled up awful. Couldn't see out of that eye in a quarter of an hour, and the other not much better, and the vicar looking everywhere for his glasses to read how big a dose for some bee medicine you had to take if bitten, as she had been, of course, and worried to death all the time in case it was fatal. It can be, you know. My old uncle was never right after being set on by bees, and he died soon after. Really? How dreadful. Mind you, he was 94, Mrs. Pringle admitted, but we all said as it was the bee stings as hastened his end. I told the vicar about it. Job's comforter as ever, was my private comment. Anyway, she took these tablets, and the vicar got out the car and took her into Caxley Cottage Hospital, and her head was fair swimming by the time he got there. She reckoned it was the medicine. The doctor said it could have been, and gave her something to help and some ointment. She come straight back and went to bed, poor thing, and you can still see where its fangs went into her. She heaved herself to her feet. Well, I'd best get on. No rest for the wicked, my mother used to say. She surveyed my reclining form with a sour expression, though that don't always seem to fit the case, come to think of it. After she returned to the fray, I opened Lucy's letter. It was dated February 12th, which showed how long it had been collecting the dust at the back of the dresser. In it, Lucy informed me that a Mr. and Mrs. Ambrose B. Edelstein and their 2 grown-up children were to be in England for 3 months. They came from, here an illegible place name, possibly Minnesota, Miniver, or even Minnehaha, where they took a keen interest in education, and the professor had several degrees in the subject. They were such a nice family, I thought of Mrs. Pringle, and would be fascinated by a glimpse of Fairacre School, so she had taken the liberty of giving them my phone number and telling them they could ring me to arrange a convenient day to visit. No need to put them up or get them meals, as they were planning to stop in Caxley, but she was sure I would enjoy having them in school for a day, just letting them have a free rein, talking to the children and looking through their work. She was ever my affectionate Lucy, and added a postscript saying that there was absolutely no need for me to feel that I must reply. I breathed a sigh of relief, for mercies received, calculated that the Edelsteins had now been safely back in Minnie-Whatsit for several months, and fell into a blissful sleep. Mrs. Pringle and the lawnmower man brought me back to earth half an hour later, and life began anew. And we'll follow Miss Reed through August, a long month, next time.